Hey guys, it's Mountain Walk, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about a sort of idea or theory or theorem or whatever, however you want to put it, this idea, sort of about the interactions between different collections of cards versus other different collections of cards. Again, it's a very general way to think of things and maybe too generalized and abstract to really make a lot of sense, but today we're talking about tribal decks. Tribal today we're going to be using as a sort of synonym for decks that are sort of linear based in some respects or synergy based, more specifically about getting the most out of weak cards to get a greater effect. Now generally what this means is, again, trying to avoid like word concept fallacy stuff, but generally we're talking about like playing weak different cards, but they get better when you play them all together in a multiplicative sort of sense, and you get a great effect. This isn't exactly like Dark Ritual ad nauseum, or like, like Lotus into Academy into like random artifact mana into Mind's Desire or Vault Key or something like that. We're talking about things specifically how people typically, again, think of sort of tribal decks or synergy-based decks or even linear decks as playing lots of weak cards to get a greater effect out of these sort of things for, like cost benefit sort of analysis. Play stuff weaker individually, but get a greater benefit. And so that's what we're really going to be talking about. We're going to be touching on a bunch of different things. But it's not, of course, this isn't, well, it is authoritative, but it's not exhaustive. So that's okay. I don't have enough time in the world to answer every single sort of complaint or objection or whatever. And again, this is also my video, and I'm a genius, so you also just have to believe everything I say is true. So there you go. All right. So, what are the reasons to play a deck, right? Like, why do we play a deck? Do we play a deck because it's cool, because it's nice, because it's sweet, because it has a lot of cards we like in it, right? So there's reasons to play a deck because it is, it has things that are sort of subjective or just things that are outside of its sort of a purview, like a metagame, right? Like there's things that aren't applicable to like how it performs in playing Magic. You're like, ah, yes, I play a deck with 8 Scaled Worms because I love Scaled Worm. Well, I mean, who doesn't love Scaled Worm? But you know what I mean. Um, and of course, there's also reasons why not to play a deck. It could be because there's a bunch of cards in this deck that I think suck. There's a bunch of like boring cards. There's also, again, more applicable to competitive scenes, which is generally what we're talking about. Well, really, exclusively what we're talking about in this sort of video is that they're too weak, they're too boring, they match up poorly versus a lot of top decks versus particular cards, so on and so forth. But again, we don't really ask these questions, but don't consider the underlying assumptions. It's not just the external influences of a metagame, but also the underlying strength and versatility of our chosen deck. This goes doubly so for tribal or synergy-based decks. So again, like I just said, it's not just like these top-down pushing down things. It's these bottom-up sort of like things that are pushing up. So it's like you have different metagame forces. It's not just like, oh, this card exists, my deck sucks, I'll never play it. Like, oh man, Force of Will exists. I guess I'm not playing like, long dot deck. Oh no, shit, Force of Will exists. Oh no, I can't play long. I can't play 4 LED and Yawgmoth's Will. Obviously, like that's not the case. And people are like, oh, you dummy. That's just a stupid dumb example. You're a dummy. You're an idiot. But again, that's the point. The whole point is it's not just these things. There are counterexamples, and these aren't even outliers. There are a lot of different reasons why you shouldn't play certain decks because most tribal decks suck. That's the reason. Like that's the reason. It's not because like, oh, X card exists or Y card exists or da 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 da. It's because these decks suck and they don't get good cards as frequently as basically quote unquote fair decks or non-linear decks, so to speak. Anyways, let's go on. All right. So, what again to sort of clarify how we would say what is a tribal deck or a synergy based deck or however you want to put it. It's a tribal or a tribal or synergy based deck is a deck that plays weak cards individually but work together to go Super Saiyan. They're not exactly combo decks per se, but can include a combo element. I don't. Again, this is kind of a. I was really struggling trying to figure out a sort of delineating factor between these sort of things, like what exactly makes a combo deck versus just an extremely synergistic pile of cards kind of thing. It's very difficult, and so I've just sort of settled for like a deck that just kind of doesn't go infinite, or whatever, versus like a deck that does go infinite, but even that doesn't work because obviously Storm doesn't go infinite. So I'm just going to rely upon the reader's own common knowledge and their own education of what is a combo deck versus what is a excuse me, I just popped my back. What is a combo deck and what is a sort of synergy, linear, or tribal based deck. Again, like it's not like, oh well then obviously these decks don't exist. Again, this is silly. That's spectrum fallacy. Just because green and yellow exist doesn't mean like colors don't exist, right? Like that's stupid. But um, it's hard. It is hard to delineate between these, but that doesn't mean there is no delineation between these. It's again things exist generally, especially archetypes. Absolutely exist on a spectrum, and you'd have to be silly to not recognize that. Everyone understands that, at least anyone with any understanding of the game. Uh, so, anyways, but for example, what are examples of archetypes that are sort of combo or tribal or excuse me, tribal or synergy based? Of course, affinity or any of the creature type tribal based decks again. So think of rebels back in the day, goblins, of course, my favorite decks, fairies, right, in standard and extended and so on. Think of decks like elves, again, another very powerful deck in multiple formats, and so on and so forth. Although really, like, there's not really that many good travel decks in multiple formats or really even in one particular format just because, uh, well, they suck. They suck generally. So there you go. Then we have things that abuse mechanics. And of course, the first thing that came to my mind about a million times over is hardened scales. Of course, hardened scales, a modern deck, abuses the power of, well, the uh, uh, tip, uh, tipular, ticular, picular, whatever, hardened scales. It abuses hardened scales, and of course the Ozolith and that kind of stuff. Both Ozoliths and Saga and things like that. So yeah, so things that generally they share a common characteristic. You put enough things of those common characteristic together, and you get a sweet thing. So yeah, that's what those decks are. There you go. All right, now this is again what I've alluded to or talked about earlier. There are reasons to play a deck and reasons not to play a deck, right? Why isn't my Zubera tribal deck good? It's because Fury exists. That's clearly not the case, right? Like I mean, your deck sucks ass regardless of whether Fury exists or the best removal is Shock. Like it is not good, dude. Not good. So again, we have things that are pushing down. This is, of course, isn't just particularly aimed at tribal decks or whatever. This sort of works against any sort of deck in any particular metagame, is that you have things like hate cards, bad matchups, and RNG, again, that push the viability of your deck down, how well it will perform in a metagame, right? Maybe there's one card that sees play in every deck, you know, a bunch of different decks, but it's just this one card that is very, very hard for you to beat. Say, like, you play a bunch of 1 toughness creatures and every deck plays Lava Dart. That would be a big one. So hate cards, bad matchups, RNG, these are an example, but this isn't fully illustrative of the full range of things that can make your deck suck, of course. But then there are things that push your deck up. Powerful enablers, strong synergy, miscellaneous powerful effects, and individually broken cards. Some of these are kind of similar or reside in the same category. So powerful enablers. Think of something like the Vial, Aether Vial, right? As well, which generally what goes with Aether Vial is usually things like Wasteland and Rished Import. So that plays well with Aether Vial. So that would be an example of a powerful enabler of these sort of dirtly decks. And really very, very few decks actually play Vial except, without exception, almost just the tribal sort of base deck. So again, strong synergy. Like, is your deck just like full of lords? Yeah, great job, idiot. What are you gonna do? You can play your Lord of Atlantis, your third LOA versus like Storm? Like, are you an idiot? How would anyone think that's good enough, right? Is that the problem, that Swords to Plowshares exists, that your deck sucks? Really, let's think about that for a second. Again, it's pretty obvious stuff, but you know, people will lie to themselves. This is the problem with Magic. People become attached to decks, cards, or ideas, and they will lie to themselves to make, like, it's not my deck that sucks, it's not this card that sucks, it's Wizards of the Coast and they're printing new cards and this and that and the other that makes my shitty deck suck. No, your deck sucked already and has been sucking for a long time. You're just looking for something to blame it on. Like, come on, right? Like, this is exactly what happens. Again, miscellaneous powerful effects. This, again, can apply to Aether Vial, but generally things like Wasteland and Port, which play really well with Aether Vial, but are not, like, specifically like, oh yeah, this is a tribal card, so to speak. Obviously, for a deck like Goblins, where it's like you get an additional element of disruption against like your worst matchups, things like combo versus the other matchups, multicolor decks, things like that. Just buying another turn to put another counter on Aether Vial is extremely powerful, again. So that's really good. And of course, individually broken cards. This is a strange one almost to say, because it's almost oxymoronic. It's not even like within the definition of a sort of like synergy deck. You don't really play individually powerful cards because they're supposed to work with other stuff to make things good. But again, that's not always the case. For example, the first few years of the game, people did not know exactly how things were going to go. So you get strong, powerful tribal cards like Goblin Lackey or Goblin Recruiter. These are not fair cards. They're not good cards for good gameplay. They put a ton of pressure on your... Even in the best, sort of most prepared metagames, they don't do good things, so to speak. They're extremely powerful. They were certainly cards that would be banned if you had access to any goblins that were worth casting. You'd have to like be full of hill giants and gray ogres, to not really be scary. So again, generally this is a fairly weaker one, but again, Goblin Lackey, Goblin Recruiter are extremely powerful reasons to want to play a Goblin deck in Vintage, which we've seen actually a lot of people do pretty well with. But again, that's a little bit of a separate conversation. But yeah, so there you go. You get the general idea. These are not, it's not an exhaustive list of all metagame pressures, right? Or metagame propellants, I guess. for lack of a better word. Things that push down on a deck's viability versus things that push up on a deck's viability. But there are a lot of different things, and it's not just like Fury exists. If we get rid of Fury, my deck will be good, or maybe my shitty tribal deck. Oh, dude, I can play Spirits again in Modern. You'll never play Spirits again in Modern. The deck sucks. It sucks. I mean, it's garbage. Like, where are you gonna play 1, 2, and 3 mana cards that don't do anything, that don't give you any card advantage, that just don't really impact the board? That like, you just play a bunch of Lords? You think that's gonna make your deck good? If playing a bunch of Lords made your deck good, every tribe would be good. This is ridiculous. Let's move on. Okay, so why not play a deck with individually powerful cards that has fewer hoops to jump through than a deck that has more cards that work better together but are easier to disrupt? So again, thinking about the sort of fair versus unfair axis, maybe in a way. Especially when we see the very strong power creep on cards that are just good on rates, answers, etc. But synergy-based decks get very little. Again, the best thing to think about is what happened in Modern Horizons 1. We saw goblins notably get like 3 very good cards: Munitions Expert, Sling Gang Lieutenant, and Pashlik Mons. Again, good, powerful cards. Rule players mostly. They're not muxes, but they are great cards. They're good. But we don't really see anything that really pushes things up, that really gives you some really strong power. Something like a Goblin Lackey, right? We just don't see this kind of stuff in modern Magic, and we just don't see any of this kind of pushing of tribal decks at all. Shit, any tribe, much less one that's been around since the beginning of the game and has been getting tribal support since the beginning of the game, since 1993 with Goblin King, Goblin Grenade, so on and so forth, right? So again, there's just, think about all the different cards that are released every year and all the different sets that are released and how many of them have, oh, we got a tribal theme, and like so very few of them even have tribal decks that are even good enough for standard. Like the Toxic deck wasn't barely good enough for standard. I mean, this is, and there was only one set with Toxic cards in standard. So, I mean, this is absurd. Like, what do you expect to happen in older formats when this shit even isn't good enough in standard? Oh yeah, I have a bunch of cards from the original Mirrodin that'll interact really well with Toxic. No, they don't. They don't even interact with Infect, other than they play well with like poison counters. I mean, it's just, Infect decks want to play a bunch of pump spells. You don't want to really do that with the Toxic decks. I mean, it just doesn't work together at all. I mean, the whole thing is just ridiculous. It's a sham. It's almost silly how poorly these decks even play together at all. Like, it's unbelievable. So like every single set, it's not even just every, like, especially for older formats, where it's not even just every standard legal set, which you get 4 a year. You get all these other sets that do all these other things with all these other different cards, and basically none of them do anything for anything that's just not like some mid-range bullshit deck. Like, is that interesting? Like, it's just mid-range bullshit, like the most fun, interesting thing. I mean, I'm so bored of that mid-range. I mean, you can only play Magic for so long and play mid-range matchups for so long exclusively. Like, again, play any friggin' standard deck for the last, I don't know how many years. It's just like, oh, mid-range deck versus mid-range deck. Oh boy, wow, look at this really great turn-by-turn interaction. Oh, it's so boring, such a slog. I mean, it's like, you must have never played Magic at all from any other era to just think that this is interesting or good. Like, it just kill me. Whatever. Anyways, number 2. More than that, said decks can't even keep up if they reach parity, because particular tribal decks rarely get any upgrades from even tribal focus sets, where good stuff decks get upgrades from every set. So basically, even So let's take Onslaught, for example, right? Not exactly the first tribal set. Fallen Empires, I guess you could say, was really quote unquote the first tribal set. But you had a tribe for each color. Goblins, I believe it was clerics and or soldiers were white. Green had beasts. Black had zombies. Red had dragons, and then blue had like not cephalids. Or merfolk. It was like, oh crap, I can't remember what blue was, but anyways, so they had like one for each. I mean, but how many creature types are there, right? Like, there's more than five. There's a little more than five. I'm gonna tell you. Yes, spoiler alert, more than five creature types. So like it's impossible to try. I mean, unless you created something like really shitty and boring, like oh, this changeling, it comes in play, and you choose like whether it's whatever its creature type is, and you draw 10 cards, and your creatures all get +2/+2, and you gain 5 life. It's like, come on, like I mean, what? It's an intractable sort of problem because again, travel stuff almost always gets extremely little. I mean, even like I said, even in standard, like I said, with toxic is the best example. I mean, there are a lot of stuff that where they have sort of quote unquote tribal things, themes in standard, and they just don't do anything. Like and if they can't even do anything in standard, what are they going to do in older formats? Oh, they'll get more cards. It's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. An expanded card pool, more synergies. Generally, that should work out, but most tribes just don't have shit at all in any format. What are you gonna do with vampires? Huh? What are you gonna do with vampires? You got Soren, what are you gonna ramp into? You ramp into your dinosaur vampire? That's sweet. What about the rest of your deck? It's garbage. It's garbage. It's totally shit. What are you gonna do? Nothing. You're not gonna do anything. Even show and telling you into like some ridiculous overcosted thing isn't gonna do crap. Like no one plays it because it's shit. So, I mean, what are you supposed to do? This is a war you cannot win ever as a tribal deck, as a synergy-based deck, as a linear-based deck. Again, something like Scales does seem to get like some support every few sets. Maybe because every other set is just like do thing, put a counter on thing. So maybe that's just by accident, right? But yeah, it's not great. It's very unfortunate, very unfortunate. But anyways, I don't. I keep getting worked up over this stuff. It's so ridiculous. It's like there's no. I mean, where's the communication about any of this stuff? About the design and development of things? About where any of this stuff is going? Nothing. We're just gonna get stuff about like bullshit, just stupid stuff. Like who cares? Whatever. All right. And this is what I would like to call the Wirewood symbiote problem. It's not. It's a problem they don't even know is a problem, so it's a double problem. Things like Wirewood symbiote, which should have absolutely been a card in the first Modern Horizons, is not a card in the second Modern Horizons, and will probably not be a card in the third Modern Horizons because who cares about elves? Who cares about elves? We're totally scared of them. They're very scary. Like, yeah, how can we ever deal with a bunch of like, cheap creatures? I mean, what if we had to play Pyroclasm in our decks? Oh my gosh, what would happen? So yeah, there are a lot of cards, a lot of tribal cards that have never been printed. I mean, it's like they're just so completely focused on things like limited, where it's like, oh, we need to have these decks for limited and this and that for limited and da da da, and it's like we can't just have these random tribal cards for limited because that'll confuse people or something. It's like, holy shit! Do you think like your players have like 10 extra chromosomes? I mean, what is going on here? Wirewood Symbiote is a card that should have been in MH1, at very least in MH2. I mean, there should have been a lot more L support in MH1, at least a couple cards more than nothing, but they didn't do that. And same thing for MH2, we basically just got Gorillion Ranger, which is a good card, but really nothing. Symbiote is the backbone of the symbiote sort of visionary card drawing engine, and of course we don't have that. Of course, why would you want to play Wirewood Symbiote to draw more cards? No, no, no. We need to make these. We need to make sure Murktide is still tier 1 again. So let's unban Preordain. Very important. Very important. Don't worry about Glimpse. No, we need to unban Preordain. Murktide is not good for 1 second. We need to unban Preordain. Quote Wizards of the Coast CEO. So yeah, like this is the problem. They just don't print cards that are even just like completely modest, not very outstanding, just nothing really scary about them. They won't even put those in the set. They're like, oh, we need to have a tribal theme, otherwise reasons. I mean, there's no reason. I mean, it's so absurd. Like they're just completely, they make these rules up for themselves to tie themselves in knots for no reason. It's absurd. It really makes no sense. But again, this is when you have a hive mind of dummies, right? Yeah, I'm sure maybe they're nice people, but they probably suck. But they're dummies. That's the thing. You know, like, oh, we got all these rules. These rules hamstring us. Oh my gosh, I'm so scared of. What if someone has fun one time, but then they have fun? Whatever. I hate it. I hate it. Anyways, I'm mad. Next slide. Okay. Okay. So again, when we're talking about these things, is the answer to print hyper broken cards for synergy decks? No, I don't think so. It's certainly threading the needle to create or reprint or, of course, unban interesting and strong tribal cards, but it does no one any good to create broken ones that cause more problems than they solve, although, again, generally these things tend to go away over time, although it's, again, on a sort of annual schedule, not like a short-term monthly schedule. I'm sure Wizards is totes aware of this, and no way the status quo of basically forever will continue into perpetuity. I mean, literally, Murktide is not good for 1 second, and they're like, we need to unban Preordain. Like, next month, if Murktide isn't the best deck, they'll probably unban Ponder and Misstep and Gataxian Pro, because, like, it's a fair deck, and it does I mean, it's unbelievable. Like these guys have just completely. It's so stupid. It's very stupid. So yeah. Again, it is difficult. Here's the sort of counterpoint to what I've sort of been arguing. To be fair, it is very difficult to sort of design these cards, tribal, linear, synergy, sort of quote unquote unfair cards or whatever, things that are just like individually weak, but you put them together, they're strong. So those kind of things are very difficult to sort of design, especially for a format like Modern, right? Like it's very easy to miss certain things, but it's if you don't push hard enough, I mean, they will do nothing. I mean, look at basically every tribal set. Look at how all these cards have done nothing in lower formats. I mean, how many good tribes are there? Goblins, elves, and I guess merfolk, right? Sorta. Well, okay, maybe that's me being a little too unfair, but goblins, elves, merfolk, I mean, that's basically it, right? I mean, it's really nothing else. Like zombies, it does nothing ever, right? I mean, getting soldiers or anything like that, spirits. I mean, like all these things are like low power formats, like formats with other different restrictions, stuff where it just doesn't. They don't do enough, right? Like most tribal decks are like, what if we got another +1/+1 lord? Wow, great! I bet that'll totally differentiate you from every other deck if they got +1/+1 lords. I mean. Well, Slivers is a good one. Probably the one that's sort of, I mean, it's a lot better than frickin' Spirits, that's for sure. Sorry, Spirits fans. No offense, but I mean, look, you don't have anything like any of the sliver, like muscle sliver, right, or sinew sliver, or crystalline sliver, or hibernation sliver, or even stuff like flash sliver. There's a bunch of different broken cards for sliver. There's even like individually good cards, things like the sliver overlords and things like that, sliver queens. Of course, those are sliver queens mostly as a combo card and War Gorge Dragon, but um, yeah, I mean, it's just, I mean, even then, it's like, well, slivers are only on Dominaria, so how many slivers do we get? We get Cloud Shredder Sliver was the last good one a couple years ago, which was the last good one for a decade or something. I mean, like, how you can't, for example, think about Goblins and Legacy, or how good it was in the beginning, where it's like you could easily say it was the best deck. But over time, up until like 2009, 2010, 2011, it didn't really get anything. And sure, it got Cavern of Souls, which is an extremely powerful card and an integral card, but like Cavern is only good as the cards you're casting, which is again is sort of only makes the problem of the tribal deck more apparent, right? Because again, the whole thing is all of your cards sort of work together, do great stuff. Like casting 3 mana 1/1s off of Matron, or casting Matron, right, off of Cavern of Souls isn't always going to be the best thing to do, or you're going to die before you can even do it. So it's like, yeah, that's good, but like, is it really doing anything relevant? Is it doing anything important? Really not most of the time, unfortunately. And I mean, it's not an easy problem to solve to make these decks good in some way. You would need sort of more generalized cards like Aether Vial to sort of prop these decks up. You'd also, I mean, again, you have Vial and Cavern, which are great, and of course Wasteland and Port, which go really well with Vial, but you need so many more things to make these decks worth playing. I mean, think about how important 1-drops are. What tribal decks have good 1-drops? Goblins and Elves. That's it. Lackey and Vial, or like all the mana elves and, well, elves, and that's basically it. Like, even for all the sweet cards that Merfolk got in MH1, it basically just got like it got a couple good cards at 1 mana cost, but I mean they're just like nothing to really write home about. Like, who cares? Like, not a big deal. And it's not like every deck should get Lackey, but like if we're talking about how good these decks should be, you're gonna really have to push the limit. So again, it's a very hard problem to fix. So like, if I'm being completely serious, not just shit posting, it is an extremely hard limit to push, because in some respects, tribal decks or linear or synergy decks are very similar to combo decks, whereas like if you push too hard, these things break in a much harder way than you ever expected. It's like, oh yeah, Lackey's fine, but ooh shit, we printed Muxus, son of a, and like, people are getting killed on turn 2 with Muxus into play uncounterably, and it's just like that kind of stuff. It's like, oh, I have cards to beat you, I'll just play infinite removal, and they just draw 100 cards. So like, that doesn't work either. So like, there's a big problem with like trying to balance these things, and it's extremely difficult because it's not apparent or obvious how good any particular card is good in any particular deck, because it's not just the synergies within the deck, but their overall interaction within the metagame. That is also an issue. But anyways, yeah, the whole thing, very difficult, very sad, very confusing. And yeah, so there you go. There you go. But yeah, I don't know. I'm glad. Look, I can play Preordained and Murktide. Whew, I was glad it was. I almost thought maybe I would never be able to play Murktide again for 1 week, but thankfully Wizards of the Coast came to my rescue. Maybe I'll get Ponder again to make sure Murktide is definitely tier 1 for the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years. I would be very sad. Then maybe we can get Days and Force of Will. Whew, that'd be good. Anyways, that's great. Gonna go pray at my altar of Goblin Recruiter now. So this has been fun, real fun, great. I'm just totally happy. Everything cool. So thanks for stopping by, guys, and have a great day.